Stephen Wilson. This is my co-host, Mr. Timothy Bowness.
Hello.
There he is, yeah. So today, we are going to talk 1994, 30 years ago. Where were you 30 years ago? Where were you, Tim, 30 years ago?
I wasn't even born.
Weren't even born, okay. So just to put things in perspective, 30 years ago, 1994, Harry Styles and Justin Bieber were born. Forrest Gump, Pulp Fiction, and Shawshank Redemption were the big critically acclaimed movies of the year. I don't know about you guys, that makes me feel really old. But 1994, myself and Tim, we were still interested in albums, weren't we, in 1994?
Still are.
Still are, but there were some great albums released in 1994. It was still, I still think of it as a golden era for the album, something that you'd listen to from beginning to end. You'd sit down and you'd allow yourself to be taken on a musical journey. So we are going to talk about the albums released in 1994, the ones we love and the ones we don't love so much. Which ones have dated well, which ones have dated not so well. And we like to do these in categories, so we've made our own categories. So we're going to start in 1994, we're going to start with art rock. And we're going to start with a couple of albums that I still, to this day, absolutely adore. So we are going to start off by talking about this one, Jeff Buckley's Grace. Now, interestingly enough, Tim, we were big fans of his dad, Tim Buckley, weren't we, when we came to this?
Yeah.
And I remember being very skeptical because, let's face it, historically speaking, the pedigree of offspring of great artists being great isn't that good, is it?
I mean, it can happen.
I'm thinking of Bob Dylan's son.
Okay, Jacob Dylan, yeah.
Yeah. But this is an extraordinarily good album, isn't it, Grace? What a fantastic record. Do you like it, Tim?
I do, and it was an interesting thing with Buckley because I saw him probably on his very first UK performance and his last UK performance, and I've never seen two such contrasting gigs. So the first gig I saw him at, he was in a tent with only a few hundred people. It was him, American Music Club, Helmet. It was meant to be the Melody Makers indie tent. And he came on and no one had expectations. They didn't know who he was. He came on with the band and they exploded into tracks. This was 93, that hadn't been released at that point. And from the opening seconds, an amazing, dynamic, elastic band. They blew everyone's minds. Within the first few seconds, everyone was on side. They were completely committed. He barely spoke to the audience, and they did a short half-hour set that was mesmerizing. 2 years later, Shepherd's Bush Empire, I think, he's headlining. Grace has become seen as a masterwork. He was clearly out of his head. He was clearly bored. There'd be bits in between songs where he'd be rambling incoherently to the audience going, sure, you love me, you fucking love me. And then he'd be doing yodeling in a Robert Plant style for 4 minutes. And the band would be kind of looking at him. And I'm guessing it was the drugs, but it was a total, he suddenly had the audience and they did love him. So when he shouted, you love me, and he was throwing cigarettes at the audience, they were going, Jeff, we do love you. We love you, man. But it was horribly indulgent. And the songs went on for what seemed like 50 minutes. Whereas in this half an hour where no one knew who he was, and he had to convince these people that he was a genius, he did it. And like you, I was skeptical because I was a huge fan of Tim Buckley. And the thing is that Jeff Buckley had his own voice, had his own approach, and it was a brilliant band. I think people forget it wasn't just him. What a stunning band. They had, to me, the kind of elastic qualities that you see in early Led Zeppelin at their best.
There's a kind of comparison for me with Jeff Buckley's Grace, which is when you listen to it, when you kind of analyze the album, and maybe some people here would agree or disagree with me, there's nothing inherently different about what he's doing. It's standard rock music. Guitar, bass, drums, voice. But the analogy to me would be something like with Nirvana's Nevermind, which again is just essentially, if you boil it down, what fundamentally that is just a heavy rock album. It's the combination of the songs, the lead voice, and the charisma that somehow makes a record transcend everything else similar around it. And Jeff Buckley's Grace has that too for me. There's something about it, if you listen to it, there's nothing particularly innovative or new or fresh about it, in much the same way that there was nothing particularly fresh or innovative about Nevermind. But that combination of a great songwriter, great songs, just brilliant songs, very charismatic frontman, and a great singer that you believed. When you listen to his voice, you believe him. Whatever he's singing to you, somehow makes that record transcend, everything else around it that was very similar.
I think the closest comparison this year is probably the Soundgarden album. And I think partly it's because they're almost reinventing in a brilliant and natural way that 70s rock band. And I suppose you hadn't had that kind of flexibility, scope and dynamism in hard rock music for probably a decade or two. I think the 80s had leached that out of rock music.
We're going to talk about Soundgarden because Chris Cornell and Jeff Buckley were good friends while Jeff was alive. So we like Jeff Buckley's Grace. Right, so let's move on to another a very different kind of record here. This is 9 Inch Nails' The Downward Spiral, which I absolutely adore this record. When I heard this record 30 years ago, it kind of blew my mind in terms of what was possible in terms of production in 1994. And I always think of Trent Reznor ultimately as a producer. This is a producer's album. We talked about the Jeff Buckley Grace album, nothing superficially being that new. Everything about the Downward Spiral felt new to me at the time, even though now I listen to it and I can hear it's kind of a melting pot of industrial music. There's a lot of Depeche Mode in there. There's a lot of metal in there. There are good songs too, but everything is beautifully polished. I mean, industrial music traditionally was very lo-fi, very, kind of amateurish in a good way, sort of outside of music. This is not amateurish. This is just incredibly produced. The production is polished, and also he was a great showman. He knew how to put on a great show too. But the Downward Spiral, for me, when I listen to it now, it's still like a textbook of possibilities of production. It's just dynamic and still sounds, there are still sounds on this record to me. I mean, unfortunately, one of the problems I think he had with the record is that it almost became a self-defining record in his career. That everything else after, it was so advanced, everything else after this has kind of been, to the point, I don't know if you've seen, you might have seen, there's a clip on YouTube, there's somebody did a piss take called This Is a Trent Reznor Song. And it's almost like taking all the cliches of 9 Inch Nails and kind of homing in on them, which is a little bit unfair. But there are certain things, there are certain gestures that are very, very familiar to 9 Inch Nails fans and Trent Reznor fans. And they're all kind of encapsulated beautifully on the Downward Spiral. Obviously, Hurt was made very famous as a song in the Johnny Cash version. I still prefer the 9 Inch Nails version myself.
See, I prefer the Johnny Cash version. I love both,
the Johnny Cash version, yeah.
Johnny Cash definitely has the edge for me.
But it's absolutely dazzling as a production, isn't it? Absolutely dazzling.
I think it is, and I think I was drawn to it originally because I'd read some interviews with Trent Reznor, and because he was American, I don't think he quite had the same sort of fashion dictates that he had in Britain. So in Britain at the time, Melody Maker NME were very critical of anything old. And so when he was being interviewed about it, and you may or may not remember this, he was talking about albums like Peter Gabriel's 3 and 4 and Pink Floyd's The Wall as being seminal albums for him. And I was drawn to that and the fact that Russell Mills, who did the amazing artwork for it, had also done sleeves for David Sylvian and Japan, so that immediately grabbed me. And when I heard it, like Stephen, I loved the dynamics in the music and the fact that it was kind of going from sophisticated electro-pop to industrial metal, but it had an edge, it had a quality, an emotional depth that perhaps comes from his obsession with Roger Waters' era Pink Floyd and so on. There was certainly a lot of influences in 9 Inch Nails that made it special, and he transcended them.
That's about the only thing about it that sounds like it's from the conceptual rock aspect to it does kind of hark back, as you say, to things like The Wall. But that's the only aspect about it that sounds slightly nostalgic, isn't it? Everything else about it is so modern. Yeah. It's so new.
Well, at the time, it was lumped in with Marilyn Manson, wasn't it?
Well, he was producing Marilyn Manson at the time. Marilyn Manson was like, for me, was like the cartoon version of 9 Inch Nails. Do you know what I'm talking about? It was kind of all the populist elements of Nine Inch. But Nine Inch Nails really feels like art to me. It's industrial, it's synth pop, it's noise, it's metal, it's hardcore.
Well, also as a conceptual and musical arc, it gives the lie to this idea. You know, we still know people who say, well, really, music's never been the same since the 60s and the 70s. And in terms of pure ambition and scope, that has it in spades, I think.
It completely does. So anyway, just spoiler alert, this is definitely one of my, going to be in contender for my album of the year. Let's move on. Some other entries in the art rock category this year. Bark Psychosis, Hex. Somebody here knows that record?
3 people.
Congratulations. We really like Bark Psychosis. Now, maybe this gentleman here, these guys down here will agree or disagree, but for me, this is the start of the influence of almost the legacy of Talk Talk beginning to kick in. And this is the beginning of what we kind of think of as post-rock, isn't it?
I suppose it is. I mean, it's very, very influenced by Talk Talk. If you don't know it, it's a really nocturnal album with a sleeve that echoes that. And it does sound as if, because actually they started off as a more experimental noise band, didn't they? But this album...
More shoegazy band.
Yeah, but this album is almost 100% influenced by the last 2 Talk Talk.
Well, I disagree, because I
albums.
listened to it again and I didn't hear as much. I don't think it's a carbon copy of Talk Talk. The Talk Talk influence is
I think the
clear.
vocals are very different for a start.
Yeah. There's something about the idea of them deconstructing the song, which is very relatable to Talk Talk, and also the kind of use of space and silence. And it's kind of exploring an area somewhere between beauty, noise, and silence.
Yeah.
And that is kind of what gives it that Talk Talk palette in a way.
I think the drums as well have a very
The drums
strong
have that very Talk-Talky, roomy
Talk Talk
sound.
influence,
Yeah.
yeah.
But the voice is actually, compared to Mark Collins, is a very underachieving voice.
Totally.
It's a very shoegazy, sort of natural, kind of a weak voice, but it kind of works.
Oh, it
in the
really
context.
works. I think the whole album has this hypnotic, narcotic, nocturnal feel that just drags you in. And as you say, it's kind of the first example of Talk Talk, who at the time, again, people forget, you know, I'm talking about when Nine Inch Nails were discussing Pink Floyd and Peter Gabriel. In the British press, if you said that at the time, you would be laughed out of a room. And the same with Talk Talk. I mean, the last couple of Talk Talk albums, we now see them as classics. But I'm here to tell you the NME 1 out of 10 review was not very positive. And they may now say it's an all-time classic, but these albums, Rain Tree Crow being another one, which was a personal favourite in 1991.
But they loved Bark Psychosis, I remember.
But they loved
them.
Bark
So by
Psychosis.
that time, Talk Talk beginning to
but
be
it's only
sort of
3
heralded.
years, 2.5, 3 years.
Yeah.
But some of these albums had been absolutely slaughtered as pretentious, poetic wastes of space, you know.
Well, quality will out. There you go. So, I don't know, would you agree with that description of the album? No? A perfect description, thank you very much. Can we put that on the poster, put on the website? Okay. Yeah, it's kind of the beginning in a way. I mean, post-rock became a very big thing a few years later. All the bands coming up, Chicago bands like Tortoise, Godspeed You Black Emperor. It's kind of the beginning of that aesthetic, isn't it? The beginning of that kind of approach to music, deconstructing the song, space, texture, not being afraid, you know, that idea of just building and building and building, throwing in a string quartet in the middle of the song for no reason.
And like the Talk Talk, you can't necessarily think of individual tracks that you would hum or point out as classics. It works as an album as a whole, which is why it's a great choice for this.
Yeah. So other albums, just a couple of other examples, and just one more example in the art rock category. Divine Comedy, Promenade. Tim, you're a fan of Divine Comedy. I've never really listened to them, but and I remember you talked about them over the years to me.
Yeah, massive fan. I mean, this was the first album where he really finds his voice. He was an incredible talent at a very early age, quite precocious. But this album, it's mainly him with string quartets. And it was such an unusual album for the time because it was closer to Michael Nyman's soundtrack work with Peter Greenaway, but with his very literate lyrics and his slightly Scott Walker-influenced voice. But he always had more of a sense of humour. So this was before they really struck gold in the later mid-90s. But you could see what a massive talent he was. Beautiful sweeping melodies, an obsession with Europe, and as I've said, almost this Michael Nyman.
Europe, the band, the Final Countdown.
The Final Countdown.
Big influence.
Yeah.
Wow.
In
Understandable.
Fact, it wasn't. But anyway, Europe itself as a continent
Okay, I'm disappointed.
The grand buildings of Harlem.
Let's move on to another category now. This dovetails beautifully into the next category, electronica and IDM. Now, in 1994, this is probably the music I was most interested in. Because for me, the mid-90s is a golden era for electronic music, the way technology is driving electronic music. And interesting, because one of the first times we're going to talk about in this category is Underworld's Dubnobasswithmyheadman. Now, Underworld were interesting because they were essentially, they'd been a synth pop group, and they transitioned into more of an electronic dance sound, kind of post-Detroit techno sound. But what made them special was the use of vocals.
Yeah.
And so they had this lead vocalist who wasn't an anonymous R&B singer. He was quite quirky. The way he approached lyrics was in this very kind of cut-up, stream of consciousness way. And I think I'm going to be right in saying, Tim, that this is probably the only thing on the electronic list that you genuinely like. And the reason you genuinely like it, because I know you, is because of that humanizing element of the lead voice, Carl Hyde's lead voice. Would I be right?
You're pretty right.
Yeah.
I mean, I love this album, and Carl Hyde is a major reason why I love this album. And I saw Underworld live as well, and they were stunning. Again, it's this mesmerizing, almost hypnotic, somewhere between, I would say, beat culture, dance culture, but again, that Philip Glass, Steve Reich repetition. And he was quite a charismatic performer, quite entertaining, with these incredible beat-influenced lyrics, flashes of melody, wonderful observations of British cultural life. I mean, there's a real poetry in...
Very surreal, though, isn't it? I mean, like titles
surreal,
like Skyscraper, I Love You, you know, things like that. But I think the point I'm making is if you take Carl Hyde, if you take his voice off those tracks, they're fairly generic. I mean, I like them, don't get me wrong. They're fairly generic techno tracks, aren't they?
I still think they're interesting because they have...
I think they're a cut above,
They have unusual shifts. I think the thing is with Underworld, suddenly you will get beautiful chords that come in from nowhere. And their background actually is more peculiar than what you were saying, because they started off as a band called Freur, and they were an electro-pop band in the early 80s. They then became Underworld, and Underworld were produced by Rupert Hine.
And Connie Plank.
They supported the Eurythmics, I think, on various tours, and they had a couple of hits in mainland Europe, but were unknown in Britain. But it was actually a relatively conventional funk, electro-pop style band. And then they come from out of nowhere with this, in a way. It's an astonishing reinvention. So this was actually their third album, though to all intents and purposes, it was a fresh beginning for the band, and what a fresh beginning. And you know, for me, I think they're one of those bands that have continued to be idealistic and continued to be slippy in that sense in terms of the definitions of their music.
I really like them very much. It wouldn't be my favourite album of theirs. I think Second Toughest in Infants would be my favourite, but it's a fantastic record, very much a sign of the times. Now, let's talk about the rest of the electronic music that you're not so interested in, Tim, because it's all instrumental electronic music. How many people here are familiar with Oval, the band Oval, the artist Oval? Yeah. So this is the beginning of another, almost an invention of a genre, which is the kind of glitch-based electronic music. This gentleman here will know. And Oval became almost infamous for using CDs that were skipping as the fundaments to their music. You know, even though there is this kind of intellectual conceit at the core of the music, it's glitch-based electronic music. And glitch-based electronic music became very popular after this. Bjork worked with Marcus Pop.
Yeah.
You can hear a lot of it on Vespertine. Glitchtronica, artists like Ortega started to embrace glitch music as well. There was a whole scene for a time based around the idea of glitch electronic music. But it kind of starts here for me with this record, and for me it's still the classic of the genre. I find it actually incredibly emotional. There's something about the sound of malfunctioning technology. In the same way, and if I could draw an analogy here, that for years, I mean, we're at a vinyl festival here, for years the sound of scratching and crackle on vinyl used to drive people that collected records crazy. And then as soon as everyone transitioned to CDs, there was almost this nostalgia for the sound of crackling vinyl, to the extent that you'd get all these crate diggers, you know, kind of enhancing
Yeah. Well,
the
we've both done it as well.
I put loads of vinyl crackle on a lot of my music.
Pieces.
Yeah. So, and I think there's something a little bit, there's something beautiful about the sound of malfunctioning technology. In the same way, and without wishing to be pretentious here, there's something about what attracts us to other human beings. It's not the perfection, it's the imperfection that actually hooks us in. Why do we fall in love with our partners? It's the quirks. It's not the perfect thing. The most beautiful woman in the world wouldn't necessarily make you fall in love with them. It's the quirks. And there's something about, and I feel this is something that's been, without wishing to, be one of those old men sort of screaming at the clouds, there's something about pop music in 2024 that's too perfect, too polished. I don't hear the quirks anymore. All I hear is auto-tune and Beat Detective. And when I listen to things like Ovol, the sound of the CD malfunctioning makes me feel something emotional. I don't know if you'd agree with me, sir. You're a fan of this record, right? I'm assuming, yeah. There's something incredibly beautiful and emotionally affecting about it, isn't it? You're looking for unusual rhythms, and I think one of the ways you can find unusual rhythms is to introduce that random element. So if you have a CD that's skipping, there's no way you can control that, and the rhythm kind of creates itself, and that becomes something really, to me, quite emotionally binding.
But I think as well it's an era, isn't it, where things are still being defined, still being discovered. We're talking about these albums, and even though we're well into the album years and we're well into, at this stage, I suppose, DAT would have been the most advanced studio technology, which we'd just got for the No Man album, Flowermouth. We'd finally got our DAT system set up, the ADATs and so on. But there were still imperfections. There was still that possibility.
There was a lot of imperfections in early digital technology, yeah.
Which now there is less.
There's nothing, yeah.
Certainly, as you were saying, in terms of sort of beats and in terms of vocals, we live in that age of perfection, which is crushingly boring a lot of the time.
And it's interesting that we talk about modern pop music, and I think one of the reasons why the album years, we kind of define it as being mid-60s to pretty much the end of the millennium, is that music in the 21st century has increasingly become perfect. To the point now that if you listen to records from the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, you can hear the tempo changing.
Yeah.
The band are speeding up. Listen to the beginning of Money and the end of Money on Dark Side of the Moon.
There's some dodgy tuning on some of the best records of all time. Yeah.
People like Morrissey now, you listen to Morrissey now and you realise just how out of tune he's singing. I love Morrissey, we're going to talk about Morrissey later, but all of these little quirks now would be ironed out.
Yeah.
And are ironed out.
Well, I'm sure that, in the underground there's going to be some kind of revolt against perfection, and there will be records that do this.
But it's not in the mainstream. I think that's my point. All of those records are not in the mainstream.
Sure.
Some other great electronic records released. Tim's not really a fan of electronic music, so I am. Some of my favourite other records from this year: Plastic Man music, the Prodigy music for the Jilted generation. That's an interesting example. That was an electronic artist who was having #1 hits at the time.
Yeah. Well, also they fused metallic. In some ways there's a kind of British Nine Inch Nails in that they're fusing electro-pop and metal elements.
Well, not really on this album. On the following album, yeah.
Well,
Fat of the Land.
I was listening to it last night.
Okay. It's quite aggressive.
Yeah, it is very aggressive in a way that a lot of that music wasn't.
Yeah. But I just think, again, Liam Howlett, the main guy from the Prodigy, was actually a great he could write songs. He could write, even though they weren't songs necessarily, the tracks unfolded in a way that kept you interested. They had a kind of song-like pop sensibility to them. I don't know how else to explain it. Ortega, one of my favourite electronic artists of all time, their second album this year, Amber. Biosphere, Orbital released a great album, Civilization, this year. Anyway, let's move on to things that we know nothing about.
I thought you were going to talk about Aphex Twin, were you not?
No, we're going to talk about that in a minute. That comes in the ambient section. We're going to talk about a section here. Now, myself and Tim, we do try to talk about music because we want to cover all the important music from this year. But hip-hop and R&B, as you can probably imagine, is not really our milieu, to say the least.
Well, I think R&B from the 60s, 70s, and even 80s probably is, but...
Not for me, really, but anyway, if you say so, okay, I've never been particularly an R&B kind of person, but, unless you're talking Marvin Gaye, maybe, but hip-hop and R&B, there are some very big records released this year. The biggest selling record of the year was by a group called TLC. CrazySexyCool. Right, who honestly can put their hand up here and say they know and love that record? You do? No, that's fine. Don't be embarrassed. Don't be embarrassed about it. I'm embarrassed that I don't know anything about it. But the interesting thing is, it was the biggest selling record, 15 million copies. I'm presuming most of those were in America, but I think it probably was a big record internationally.
I remember the singles.
Do you?
I remember them being on TV, yeah.
Name them.
I can't. It was on the chart show, obviously.
So
Top of the Pops it would be on.
I'm sure it was on. I did do my research. I did go and listen to TLC's CrazySexyCool, and I can't honestly say I recognise any of the songs, even though many of them had been multi-billion selling, triple platinum records. The one thing I was struck by is I can draw a very strong line between this record and what's going on in pop right now.
Mm-hmm.
Pop music these days is very much led by female R&B divas, isn't it? The most dominant artists in popular culture these days are female, which is great, by the way. Don't get me wrong, that's amazing. Your Dua Lipas, your Ariana Grandes, and I can hear Taylor Swift. Less so. I think Taylor Swift's a bit more diverse than that. She comes from the country background, but Beyonce. But these, I can kind of see the seeds of that in this album released 30 years ago, TLC. Mm-hmm. But I tell you what's different about it. It's pre-auto-tune. It's pre-Beat Detective. I could still hear the grain in the music. I could still hear the sound of real instruments. I could still hear the sound of real voices. Not always perfectly in tune. Mm-hmm. I can still hear there is a lineage between what they're doing and, say, what Aretha Franklin was doing 20, 30 years ago.
Yeah.
Before that. I cannot hear that at all in modern R&B music. I cannot hear it at all. But at this point in time, I can still hear, and this is based, just listen to 2 or 3 songs, that's all I'm basing this on. But in my ignorant sort of state with regard to this, I can still hear the influence of classic R&B and classic soul music in this music. It still has a grain to it. Here's a record that, again, I did not know at all, and I have to say, I'm very impressed. Mm-hmm. Very impressed. Nas, Illmatic. Okay, a lot more people know that record. Okay. I didn't, okay? I wasn't listening to hip-hop music at the time. I was actually very impressed, I've got to say. I think the thing for me always with American hip-hop music is sometimes it's very hard to relate to the lyrical content. And, you know, ultimately I was hearing a lot of words that I associate with the kind of archetypal hip-hop, guns, bass heads, hoes, all that stuff. And I'm sorry, I'm a white middle-class English boy. It doesn't really speak to me about my life growing up in Hemel Hempstead. Seeing Marillion, the local club, you know, on a Tuesday night. It didn't speak to me. But I have to say, musically, I was pretty blown away with this record. The invention in the backing tracks was very strong. Even though the lyrics don't relate to my life, I have to say there was a few lines that jumped out at me and said, fucking hell, that's brilliant. I don't sleep because sleep is the cousin of death is the one that springs to mind. What a great line. What a great line. So I think, you know, there is a sense that it depends on your musical upbringing, your musical culture, how you come across music, how you engage with music. Hip-hop music is difficult for me as a middle-class white boy growing up in England, sometimes to find a doorway into this world of American hip-hop. Do you know what I mean?
I do. I mean, for me, when I listen to albums, because we did have an, you know, I loved Public Enemy. I loved the violence in their music and some of the Daisy Age hip-hop as well. I really liked.
That's a few years earlier than this, though.
It is. And when I listen to this, it's almost like when I'm listening to the electronic or ambient albums from this year, that I'm listening to it from a musical point of view. So I love the really unusual juxtaposition of quite avant-garde jazz cut-ups.
Yeah.
So I'm listening to it almost as an ambient experience. And I like it. I really like the use of cut-ups, the use of samples.
So let's move on. We're going to talk ambient here, which is kind of, you know, a little bit of a close relation of electronic and IDM. And obviously we could have put this in the category here. Aphex Twin, one of my heroes, Richard D. James. Just think fucking genius. Selected Ambient Works 2 came out this year. And funnily enough, it's just about to be reissued. In fact, we've got the reissue here.
Not released yet.
Don't steal it because it's not released yet. There it is. There's the reissue. There you go. Have you ordered that already? I have. So now, Tim, you've always been a bit Aphex skeptic, haven't you? Let's face it.
No,
I think he's a
like
genius.
some of the stuff.
You've always thought he's a bit of a chancer, haven't you? Come on, let's face it. So you always say Brian Eno invented all kinds of music.
Well, he invented music.
I say Richard
stop.
James invented all electronic music.
Yeah?
Since 1990, yeah.
No, I like it. The thing is, I really, this sort of category of music, the electronic, the ambient, I automatically like it all. But I don't automatically feel massively attracted to it or enthusiastic. So this album, I bought at the time of release. I liked it. It went to the back of my collection straight away. Yeah, I was more interested in the Jeff Buckley, more interested in the Nine Inch Nails, because they gripped me emotionally. It's not saying it's bad. And I did listen to it again for the podcast, and I do really like it. So it's not something that I poo-poo, contrary to Mr. Wilson's comments.
Right, well, you told me that when you first listened to it, you thought it was really dull and really uninteresting. So there you go. Now, 30 years later, I'm glad to hear you've slightly revised your opinion. Now, here's my case here. This album invented for me a form of music which I know you do like, the hauntological thing.
I do.
Now, hauntological, people who don't know, hauntological music is kind of, well, I guess the best way you could summarize it is it's electronic or ambient music which somehow sounds like it's beaming in from the past. So there's an artist that we both like called The Caretaker, for example, who his music set is all constructed from, sounds like it's all constructed from like 1920, 78 records, but filtered through a kind of modern electronic processing. So it's both modern, but it also sounds like it's coming from a million years ago. Richard D. James invented that form of music in 1994. No Man's
Death and Dodge's Dream Child.
No, here's my proof. Right, so this is track 5. All the tracks were untitled. Here's track 5 from Aphex Twin, Selected Ambient Works Volume 2, Hauntological Music. The texture, something's happening there. But also, he's doing something quite unusual in electronic music, which he's using microtones, which is, he's not using the conventional 12-tone scale. He's deliberately detuning things to give you even more of a feeling of discomfort, queasiness. It's uncomfortable. It's very sinister to me.
I really like this, but I'm hearing someone's voiceover. I'm immediately conjuring melodies like in my head.
Yeah, this is what I say with you about the. I can kind of predict exactly what electronic artists you're going to like. It's the ones where there's a strong solo voice, sometimes a singer or an instrumentalist. You don't tend to like music that is reduced to pure rhythm and texture. With a few exceptions. I know what you're going to say. As long as Brian Eno's involved, you'll like it.
Well, he invented this.
He invented music. Obviously, Brian Eno invented music. There is an argument to say that Richard D. James started the whole, what we think of as intelligent dance music, intelligent modern electronic music, with albums like Selected Ambient Works, with singles like Didgeridoo, Analog Bubble Bath. I'm a massive fan. He doesn't put out a lot these days. I wish he did. But these records for me are absolutely seminal and quite unique.
It's very beautiful. But again, I'm even imagining Miles Davis's trumpet over this.
Yeah, but then that would be something different.
John Hassell.
It would be something different. It's ambient. It's not supposed to have a... What? It's ambient music. Nothing's supposed to happen. Anyway, Selected Ambient Works Volume 2. But okay, now... beautifully dovetailing into this next thing, because we're going to talk about now a record that is dark ambient that has a solo voice over the top of it.
Oh, I like this.
You know what I'm talking about, don't you? Now, this is one of the things we love to do on the podcast is talk about records that very, very few people know, but that we think
just
are
so we
actually...
can feel superior.
No, quite the opposite. That we actually think are very easy to get into. They're not difficult records. Sometimes records are obscure because they're kind of very much an acquired taste. But there are certain records we've talked about on the podcast, for example, John G. Perry's Sunset Wading, Virginia Astley's From Gardens Where We Feel Secure, that are people, Durutti Column's first album,
Yeah.
very accessible, but they're not very well known, but we kind of feel emboldened to say to everyone, if you're a music lover...
The Rupert Hine trilogy, this last
Rupert Hine trilogy.
Yeah.
If you're a fan of music, you almost can't fail to find something to appreciate in these records. This is an example. Murder Ballads, Martyn Bates and Mick Harris. Now, Mick Harris was the drummer in Napalm Death, but don't let that put you off. Mick Harris very early on left Napalm Death and became someone much more interested in the world of electronic music and dark ambient music. And he had a project called Lull, which was dedicated to creating these incredibly oppressive, dark soundscapes, beatless, dark soundscapes. In 1994, he got together with Martyn Bates, who had been the singer in a fairly obscure electronic 80s band called Eyeless in Gaza, who myself and Tim, we've probably talked about Eyeless in Gaza
We have
on the
talked
show.
about them, yeah.
And they took these traditional folk songs, going back centuries, English folk songs, and they produced these dark ambient versions of them. And I'm going to do another piece of high tech here for you, because we don't have the vinyl. They have been released on vinyl, actually. Very, very interesting, unique approach to ambient music is to sing these classic British folk songs.
So it's basically centuries-old British folk songs sung over contemporary dark ambient, and it was such a fresh idea and really nicely executed.
And actually, I feel very accessible. So this song is called The Death of Polly, which is an old British English folk song, I believe, or American folk, I think English folk song.
She jumped up behind and away they did ride. She jumped up behind and away they did ride.
I suppose the point here is that these songs were always incredibly dark. And if you think dark music started with Slayer, or whatever, go back and read the lyrics to some of the old traditional folk songs, going back centuries, and they are dark.
Yeah.
They are very dark, very creepy. So in a way, this is almost like reclaiming this incredibly dark ambient music and just this lonely voice. And the songs are all 15, 16 minutes long. They unfold at a very slow rate. These very dark Murder Ballads. The album is called Murder Ballads. And it really works. And I feel like anyone could enjoy it because anyone could relate to the sentiment of the lyrics. And
it's a real pity it's not been picked up by the British folk press or the British folk programmes. We still have programmes on Radio 2 dedicated to folk music. And this, for me, was a reinvention of British folk music in the way that people like Pentangle Fairport Convention were doing in the 60s and 70s, where they were radically reinterpreting sometimes centuries-old pieces in a fresh underground rock vocabulary. Sailor's Tale. I think it's not Sailor's Tale, it's the Sailor's Life, isn't it?
Oh my God, what an error.
Sailor's Tale is King Crimson, Sailor's Life
Terrible
is
error.
Fairport Convention.
God, Inner Views by Stevie Wonder, yeah?
Yeah, Inner Views, Anil Prasad.
Yeah.
I know.
So anyway, that's an album.
Babacom Lee, 1972.
Yeah, all right. That's
Brian
an album.
Eno,
These are
the
all
film music.
In case you don't know, these are all errors we've made on the podcast before and paid the price. I feel like this is an album that I could, even people that don't like dark ambient
very
music,
much so.
that I feel people could find something quite emotionally affecting in.
And it's really annoying that it hasn't been picked up on or discovered as a classic.
It's very obscure. Anyway, Martyn Bates and Mick Harris, Murder Ballads. Definitely worth spending some time with.